Okay, let's make a start. Καλησπέρα σας. Ευχαριστώ που ήρθατε όλοι. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight to the Inaugural Dimitris Tsaloumas Commemorative lecture. And a special welcome to Vrasidas Karalis and Oscar Tsaloumas, the son and grandson of the great poet. Also, a great honor to have with us Professor Karalis. I think this is your 18th visit to Melbourne this year. I mean, why put yourself through the hassle? Just move down here, Vrasidas, and solves that problem. And we've got better weather anyway. So, but before we commence tonight's event, there's quite a few household items. Firstly, just mention of a book launch by Christos Fifis on Sunday, the 12th of November, 3:30, Pontiaki Kenotita, 345 Victoria Street, Brunswick. He'll be launching his book, Ελληνοαυστραλιανές Αναφορές. So an open invitation to everyone. We have invites at the table at the back if you require the details of this event. On the 12th of Sunday, the 12th of November, okay, we'll get you an invitation, Olga. On the 20th, Monday, the 20th of November, if I recall, we're having a panel discussion here. The facilitator will be the refugee activist Karapanagiotis, and we'll be launching 3 books simultaneously on sort of migrant stories. You will get an email regarding that, and hopefully next lecture we'll have some more information, a flyer to sort of go out. Let's see, can't read my own writing. So that's the panel discussion. Now, you know, although we finished our seminar series last September, we really have an event almost every Thursday, and you should all have received at your seats just a flyer regarding the 120-year celebration of the Greek Community of Melbourne. So this year the community celebrates 120 years. You know, it's quite an amazing achievement, the longevity of our community. And to commemorate this anniversary year, there'll be a series of events, lectures, book launches, and a few other things. We will be providing more details about the program. You will be getting email updates. But the flyer that you have here today is a bit of a summary, what's occurring the next month. So it's a fairly sort of packed program. The most immediate event is a lecture on Thursday, the 16th of November. Again, this location here, mezzanine level at 7 p.m., as you used to be Thursday, by our in-house researcher, Juliana Harapandidou, who will be looking at events that shaped the community before the war. And she'll have a follow-up lecture the week after, looking at events after the war. 19th November, we have the celebration of the Polytechnic here at the community. And an event not to be missed on Thursday, the 30th of November, Andrew Giacomos, who is part Greek, part Aborigine. He's the Commissioner for Aboriginal Children, will be giving a presentation here at the community. So I think it's the first time he's presenting at the community, Thursday the 30th of November. And there's a book launch of George Michalakakis on the 3rd of December and a few other events. So take a close look at the program, and we hope to see you at most of these events, a very important year that we're commemorating. Okay, and I'd like to thank the sponsors of tonight's lecture, Dean Kalimniou, the Greek Australian Cultural League. This is an event they've been able to sort of co-sponsor this event with the community, and we've agreed that this will occur every year to commemorate Dimitris Tsaloumas. So this will be an annual event in conjunction with the Greek Australian Cultural League. So thank you very much. So Kathy and her colleagues, and also Hellenikis and L Publishing, who've kindly donated some books on the works of Dimitris Tsaloumas, and we have them available for sale at the back. So please browse through them before you leave tonight. Enough for me. I'm going to invite the Secretary of the Greek Australian Cultural League, Yanis Georgiou, to say a few words about tonight's event and introduce the speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Κυρίες και κύριοι, Professor Karalis, εκ μέρους του Ελληνοαυστραλιανού Πολιτιστικού Συνδέσμου, σας καλησπερίζω όλους που παρευρίσκεστε απόψε σε αυτή την εκδήλωση. Thank you for attending this inaugural lecture in honor of Dimitris Tsaloumas, a remarkable and noteworthy poet in the manner that is fitting of his distinguished and acclaimed literary career. He died last year in his beloved island, his homeland, Leros. He was a truly bilingual, but not only bilingual, I mean, he was a polyglot. He knew other languages apart from English and Greek. But his poetry appears in both these two languages, English and Greek. And his admirable bounty spanned over 60 years. He has become one of the most honored poets of Greek descent here in Australia, as well as overseas. Dimitris wrote across two cultures, published widely in both languages, and managed to turn the sense of dislocation and isolation into creativity. He's truly the poet of diaspora. Someone said, and I read it recently, but I don't remember the exact reference, that another language is another culture. So every language is a culture, and I think Tsaloumas managed to make the proper bridge between the English language and the Greek language, and also the two cultures that he was doing. Let's not forget that some of his work he wrote in either one or the other language, but he reworked them in both languages also. His restless mind and his poetry mastery sculpted messages that have no geographical or linguistic boundaries. His Greekness was manifested in his themes and style, and not in his active participation in matters concerning the Greek diaspora in Australia. Dimitris communicated, produced, and created for the universal man, and the universal woman, of course. He is the universal poet, speaking the word of mankind and for mankind. He remains in Australian literature the most prolific and recognized migrant poet, the only non-Anglo-Celtic poet to have received many prestigious awards, among them the National Book Council Award and the Patrick White Award. To have received these awards, although he is a non-Anglo-Celtic writer and poet. Tsaloumas' bilingual 1983 collection, The Observatory, to Paratηρητήριο, can perhaps be credited with launching multiculturalism in Australian poetry. The Observatory was in many ways the first refutation of the policy of assimilation in the field of published poetry. It not only challenged the hegemony of English language by including the Greek texts of all the poems, but also depicted an Australian author's unashamedly and for the time daringly non-Anglo-Celtic cultural and artistic heritage. After his death last year, the Greek-Australian Cultural League resolved to award 2 literary competition prizes in his name, and we have done this with pride to worthy recipients and will continue to do so. In fact, in our annual literary competition, the first prize in the Greek language will be from last year, known as the Dimitris Tsaloumas Poetry Prize, το βραβείο ποίησης Δημήτρη Τσαλουμά. Και ως τώρα το έχουν πάρει 2 ποιητές, πέρσι το 16 και φέτος το 17. This is only a small gesture, but one that we have decided to continue for years to come. And last year also the Greek-Australian Cultural League dedicated the periodical Antipodes in his honor, and if you haven't got this issue, I wholeheartedly ask you to purchase it. It's issue 62 of 2016 with the αφιέρωμα στον ποιητή Dimitri Tsaloumas. And therefore there is now a sort of another one of these historic documents in the life and career of this poet. And although there have been other dedications and other tributes to his work in the past issues, this one is quite remarkable because it refers to a lot of the encounters of that people had in the last years of his life. On that note, we'd like to thank the collaboration of the Greek community, especially Nick Dallas, with whom we have joined forces to establish a series of lectures in Dimitris Tsaloumas' name. So this is the inaugural memorial Dimitris Tsaloumas lecture, and from now on it will be part of the calendar and the timetable of the Greek community's seminars from every year. And I believe the program has already been printed and circulates, so you'll see that if you can pencil in the next lecture, which will be also next year. Our heartfelt gratitude also goes to Helen Nikas from Owl Publishing, whose unyielding support in all the past and present events we have had together in Tsaloumas' name has been most fruitful and beneficial. So, ladies and gentlemen, and especially welcome to Oscar and Christos, we hope that you will enjoy this talk, the inaugural Dimitris Tsaloumas lecture, annual lecture, but this time by our good friend, Professor Vrasidas Karalis.
Oof. What do I have to say now? You said everything about him, you know, so I'm totally redundant in my presentation, and thank you so much for the very, if I may say, informative and detailed and highly, if I may say, in this case, you know, just a sensitive presentation of Tsaloumas' work. But anyway, I'm here, I have to say something. So, I've been invited as well. Thanks the sponsor, thanks all of you for being here today. And I'm coming from Sydney from 34 degrees, and now here it's only 15. And I feel that I'm totally unprepared for this. Thanks all first of all, the community for organizing this annual event. I think this is something that we all have to do as a Greek-Australian community, as post-Greek Australian community, I would say. A new generation is not a Greek Australian, it's post-Greek Australian. You are the postmodernists of this community, and post-postmodernists, some of you as well. So you can continue this tradition of honoring if I may call them, the founding fathers of the Greek Australian literary presence, the founding fathers of Greek Australian, if I may say, culture in general. Because we have to admit that Australian is not simply, when we talk about multiculturalism, we don't talk about multiculturalism within an Australian context. We're talking about many cultures produced here. This is the mosaic of vibrant and, if I may say, in these multidimensional traditions that coexist in a symbiotic relationship, the one with the other. We come close to each other, we overlap, we go away. This is the contradictions and the paradoxes of living together as living human beings. Don't forget that when Pascal, the great French theologian and philosopher, said, "Oh, I have so many doubts about God, and I don't believe you sometimes," he had in his mind the voice of God saying, "Of course you must have doubts, of course you must disbelieve in me, because you have already found me." And this is a very interesting tradition, as you understand, because we are all here today. We are actually building the new Australia. We are continuing an old Australia as well that has been established from the before us, and we are, if I may say, in this case, chains of, so we continue sort of a rings of a ongoing chain of cultural production. And I would like to see this event, as it was mentioned before, as an annual event, honoring the contribution of Dimitris Tsaloumas, as something that happens every year and will be continued the years to come. At Sydney University, we're celebrating the Christopher Brennan every year, the Christopher Brennan lecture, who is one of the most important Australian poets, as you know, and his office was next to mine, and he died of being drunk all day, as you remember, and he was kicked out of Sydney University for inappropriate sexual advances, and you see what happens at the academic level. And this is my point, because I think my lecture tonight, my approach tonight to Dimitris Tsaloumas is try to de-academize him. I try to bring him, to make him to the mainstream tradition, because this is what we've been discussing before with Eleni, and I'll come to Eleni before going to my lecture, Eleni Nikas, because we wouldn't have the work of Dimitris Tsaloumas all together in a comprehensive and compact way without the work of Eleni Nikas. Eleni Nikas has been essentially the other founding mother, if I say, of the Greek-Australian tradition in this case, because it was very interesting to publish a book, but most important, to write a book, but more important is to publish a book, and as Eleni knows, to distribute a book as well. And the most important, if I may say, contribution of the editor and the publisher is to understand the value of the book that they publish, because the book can have a price, but the value is essentially arranged by the democracy of letters, as we see throughout the century. It has nothing to do with the capitalist pricing of the day of how much a book costs to be printed. And I would like to thank Vrasidas Karalis for being here tonight, and his children, because it's a special honor and a bit deters me to speak out, you know, what I want to say, because for me, if I may start in at a personal level, I owe first of all, some brief knowledge of Dimitris Tsaloumas. In 1992, in the Melbourne conference that we have of Greek Studies, and without knowing me, after a while he sent me some of his books with very, very warm dedications, as you see here. And it's a very beautiful gift, because I was young, I was totally mindless, and totally stupid, if I may say, back then. And I must admit that I didn't like his poetry. And Lenny actually used to pester me. He said, now you have to discover him, you have to read him, you have to be more serious. And I must admit I was not very serious. I was very flippant. I was very young and extremely, if I may say back then, extremely seduced by the great writers of the day, especially the Greek writers of the day, and of course having arrived recently from Europe by the great postmodernists of that period, and John Asbury from the United States, and Donald Hall from England, and he was not of that period, but my great love for Rainer Maria Rilke from Germany. So I was involved with this, if I may say, the high literature of Europe and the United States, and I couldn't understand, if I may say, the humble news of Dimitris Tsaloumas back then. I felt sometimes alienated, sometimes that there was something wrong with the poetry itself, and something with the poetry as it was presented to me as well. We must admit also, and this is my lecture now, that 1 year after his death, we still try to understand the loss of the poet Dimitris Tsaloumas and appreciate still, if I may say, the significance of its work. It's really difficult in times when poetry is not read, by the way. It's not read anymore. It's not read at all, as you know. And when poetic language is really heard only through songs. We must not forget that last year the Nobel Prize was given to a songwriter. Despite that, we love him, of course, but he's a songwriter. And the year before, to an essay writer. So we're living actually the days of the end of literature, of the literary tradition. Or literature is morphing into something completely different. And it's very difficult under this within this context to be able to enter the universe of such a complex poetry, follow its verbal currents, and absorb the energy of its signs. Tsaloumas's poetry can be seen as a document of an era and as an era of poetry itself. It can be also seen as a unique poetic experience in itself, involving us, the readers, today, and present how we read poetry today in a post-romantic world. We don't believe in the genius of the writer anymore, in which poetry and the poet play no important role in the shaping of civil culture or individual aesthetics. Every time we insist on the historical and contextual realities, and I think it's very misleading to insist simply on the historical context of Tsaloumas' poetry. We imprison his distinct contribution to the particulars of the period, and this is not always the best way to appreciate poetry itself. My point is that I want to appreciate the poetry of Tsaloumas as poetry, to see how it stands within the tradition of Australian poetry and the Australian literary tradition. And this is the only way to understand and to incorporate him to the literary canon of the Australian literary histories, from which has been excluded so far with very minor exceptions. By insisting on the socio-cultural trends around him, multicultural, the Greek-Australian identity, what is this Greek-Australian identity, by the way, and Labour government, and the changes that we have in the 70s and 80s, we seem to lose the particular turn, if I may use a Heideggerian term, that his work brought to the continuum of Australian literature or literature in general. As you remember, thematically, all poets choose their subject matter for what is in front of them, or probably what is in them. Goethe called all poetry fragments of a continuous autobiography, whereas in a strange way, our own Iakovos Polilas, talking about Dionysios Solomos, declared that his poetry, and all poetry, was a continuous extinction of personality in the light of truth, as he said. Poetry, of course, can be many things to different people. Tsaloumas has written this incredible essay, The Distant Present, and Eleni has written a very beautiful essay enlightening and elucidating on the ideas expressed there. And I think we have to take it as the beginning of our exploration of his work, the distant present. It's something, a present that's now, and it's not now, but it's with us, but it's distant as well from us. In all cases and beyond all external circumstances, and I think this is what we see in Tsaloumas, and this is something that has been undervalued in his poetry, is the process of creating a world into which the poet is engaged with core elements of language, existence, and ultimately mortality. We're afraid to see the poet as a human being. His last collection of poems, Helen of Troy, I'll come back to them in many occasions, is about mortality. It's about dying, the process of dying. It's one of the most poignant, I would say, testimonies about this process of seeing your own body betraying you. And it's a magnificent depiction of the sense of losing control of your own mind, of your own bodily functions. It's an amazing book, as I see, which is, I believe, it's going to be in the future one of the classics of what Edward Said called late poetry, something that comes late in your life and recreates, reinvents your previous tradition as well. So we find poetry in the poems not as abstract quality outside the poem, but as a quality of language emanating from this poem, specific poem. For this reason, we must see his work as an amalgam of many different and occasionally contradictory states of mind. Tsaloumas' poetry is complex because his development as a poet was complex. Starting with his early poetry, we can see it is a poetry of exile, of displacement, of loss. Even in his Greek books, as you see, for some of you who read his Greek poetry, his early Greek poetry, you see there is something missing. It's a poetry of lack, of absence, of loss, something lost in this poetry. And it's, as you will see, and we'll refer to that again, it was obvious because we're talking about the post-Civil War Greece in 1949. And it was not simply migration, it was not simply death, it was exile, it was the living death of knowing that you will never see your beloved ones in the islands of imprisonment and torture we had in Greece in that period. And that period has influenced Tsaloumas profoundly, as you know. Then there's a second stage, as we see in his poems, which emerges when his poetic language gains its self-confidence in the 70s and 80s, especially when he comes to us after he came to Australia in the 50s, and gradually we have all this maturation process, gains in self-confidence and expressiveness, and this can be seen as the poetry of, if I may, I call it the early poetry in Australia, as the poetry of reconnaissance and exploration. Following this period, a new quality in his voice can be detected, which is probably, I would claim, the heart of his achievement, or what I think that's the heart of his achievements, and I call it the poetry of musical immersion into language. And ultimately, as the new period brings chronologically the last stages of his development, we can see a poetry, what I call extreme imaginative minimalism. His last poems are so sparse and so terse, sure I use a Greek term, so laconic, that actually become poems essentially like haikus, essentially like Japanese and Chinese poetry, and the most extreme minimalistic expression that we have seen. Some of the reviewers, as you remember, of his last poems were really unkind and ungenerous because they couldn't follow the process of this development, and they thought that that was the ultimate voice of the central voice of the poet, but they don't understand this is the end result of his exploration of language. And especially some of them are young today, as you understand, they fetishize modern poets. Sorry, I know that we are surrounded by modern young poets. Modern poets fetishize language. They don't understand that in the end you have to say something about yourself, about your adventure, about your mind, how you feel, who you are, and because in a few years we'll not be interested in linguistic puns or linguistic games. So, not for you, Tina. That was not for you because you go deep. All right. So there are four, according to my perception, distinct ages of development, which interpenetrate each other and can be found in each other, in each period as well, and whose coexistence gives sometimes a deep sense of rich complexity that we see in his poems, an expressive density, a stylistic compactness that did not infrequently create the wall of an overcrowded, almost hermetic vision. Some people, as you know, in Australia, especially people who read Australian literature before reading Tsaloumas, they're always, you know, just, if I may say, taken aback by this density. Don't forget that in Australian poetry, we have to this day, for some of you who read Australian poetry, that's why I try to contextualize the reception of his work in Australia. We are dominated by an orality principle. Poetry is performance poetry. The performative element of poetry is very strong in Australian literature. You can see that in John Tranter, you can see that in Michael Dransfield, you can see that in all the poets of the 70s and 80s, even, in the end, even the doyen of English poetry, Les Murray, whose work I'm very ambivalent and extremely, as you will see, very, very sort of critical of. But when you come from that tradition and you read the Tsaloumas poetry, you feel there's something odd, something extremely eccentric, if I may call it. As I mentioned earlier, we must see the work of a poet in its contradictions and in its complexities. We must not simplify it. We must not one-dimensionalize it. We have to see it in all this, complexity which is contradictory and sometimes confusing. It is not enough to say, I like something or I don't like something. Sometimes it's not even enough to explain the reasons we dislike something. For my perception, I prefer to explore what the poet tried to do, how, when, and for whom. The hermeneutics of a work are always related to the ethics of reading, the fairness and the justice with which we read poetry written by anyone, not simply by people who know, we happen to know. Ultimately, if and to what extent the work produced can be separated from the circumstances of its creation and stand the judgment of time autonomously and self-reliantly. We still read Dante, the Roman elegies, and the Greek tragedians, because despite the differences, we can still find something substantial for us in them, something that resonates with our expectations and energizes our sensibility. Sometimes we have to reconstruct the poetic circumstances of the poet. We study by paying attention to the works and names he is referring to. Reconstructing the library of a poet is one of the best ways of understanding the dialogues that his work encapsulates. In other occasions, this could be quite misleading, or in other occasions, we're given no clue how to unpack the semantics of poetic language. In the labyrinth of a poem, we must accept that we grope in the dark, finding some fragments of solid information here and there, and try to put them together in a coherent narrative in order as readers to understand our position in the process itself of reading and understanding a poem. We must never forget the self in this process of reading. A year later, after Tsaloumas' death, we can still have the question of what his poetry means today, why we read his poems, and why we should study them. I had an interview by another member of the Greek Australian community, and he said that very few people read Tsaloumas' poetry because it's very difficult. And it's very hard, he says, to follow. And it's almost incomprehensible at times. So this is, I think, I'll take exception to this, and I think that this is really simplistic to say that that's why we don't read his poems. Asking how many of you have read Seferis today? I forgot. Yeah, I forgot. How many have we read, let's say, Dante? And how many more? Only academics go beyond the second book of Inferno. Who reads Paradiso? Nobody. It's fine, you know, just but my perception, Paradiso is great. Don't get me wrong. Very few people have the patience to read that. The tradition, the Greek tradition, the greatest poem is written by Nikos Kazantzakis, 33,333 verses. Who had the patience to read this huge, epic, gigantic, mammoth poet? Nobody. Very few. I've read it 12 times, by the way. So, you know, means I have nothing else to do, as you understand. You know, only idlers read these kind of things. So this is what we have to do. Why? And I think I take exception to that statement that nobody reads the poems of Tsaloumas today, because I think that actually this is not the answer to the question, is how we read them, or not how many people read, because very few people read poetry today, right? How we read them, when we read them. And this is the purpose of these meetings here, to make, actually inspire, if I may say, even the young generation to be able to read his poems and proceed with a new hermeneutical cycle of approaching the poems themselves and adding their new sensibility, their own sensibility. Because, well, as you understand, we are all growing old, and we actually add to this our own, essentially, sense of understanding of the poem coming from our own conditioning, our own way, which is older than this one. So I believe that this is not an answer to say that very few people read the Tsaloumas poetry. I believe that many people read the poems, the Tsaloumas poem, but even if they read one poem, as you understand, for me, is an extremely important gain for poetry, and should I say for themselves as well, because it's a very important aspect of the work, how the work actually is recreated, relived in you. Also, the conditions that produced his work, the immigration, life in Australia, his political ideas, as you know, and some of you who are his friends, you must have known how strong his political ideas were in this case. And today, of course, have ceased to have the same impact as the expectations had from his work. Sorry? Relevant. They have become irrelevant. Yeah, but in the history of ideas realm, they still maintain an importance, as you understand, right? You know, I've noticed you're a communist, aren't you? You're a Leninist, as I see. You ask for a Leninist interpretation. That Leninist element will be in you forever. The revolution, it comes tomorrow. But then in this case, I mean, we can find these political ideas. Exactly. I know you all too well. So we don't read, especially the young generation, his poetry simply to see the angst of the migrant or the fear of the unknown, or in the politics of the Greek Australian community, or in his emotional circumstances. We read it in order to establish connections with his world, to see what bridges we can build with his symbols, and how we can understand his poetic language as a whole, as a development. Many people call, as I said, his poetry difficult. They insist also on the dichotomy between his poems in Greek and those in English. For some of you who have read his poems in Greek, how many have you read his poems in Greek? How many have you read his poems in English now? So you're more people, if I may say, or evenly divided. But I think more English, right? And I think it's a very interesting process to read, to see what you read, what differences we have when you what different experience you have when you read the poem in Greek and when you read the poem in English. Don't forget that his early poems, which were translated into English, like as we see in the Observatory, and we heard that before, it's the voice of a translator as well there. It's not his direct, unmediated voice that we hear, that we'll see later on in the barge and in the bridge and in the, sorry, getting old, by the way, the falcon drinking, the barge, and portrait of a dog, and the harbour, and as I see. So that's something completely different that you see, because the early poems are mediated by the translator. May I say that some of his poems in Greek are better than the translated work in English, but his poems in English are better than the translations of his early poems, by English by himself, I mean. It's very obvious because he knows how to infuse the poetic emotion into rhythms, which, if I may say, the early tradition, the early poems, the early translations were not actually very distinct for. I think that it's time now to go beyond such dilemmas and try to deal with the poetry as poetry and not as a document. We divided early his work into 4 periods. The Poetry of Exile, which starts until, I believe, until 1998 with the falcon drinking, ends with falcon drinking. The Poetry of Reconnaissance, which ends, I believe, with the harbour in 1998. Then the Poetry of Musical Immersion, as I call it, with the new poems of Exile and Sunrise with Sparrow and the final collections. And then finally the Poetry of Minimalism that we have, when the poet becomes self-translator as well. He starts translating his English poems into Greek. Self-translation is another important process that we see in his work, how he translates his poetry. Roughly, I believe these poetries coincide with the collections of poetry I mentioned, but I will see, sometimes you can see poems from an earlier period being incorporated in the later one, and that makes them very interesting. And we can really see the validity within the poems themselves through the immigration from one language to another. In an essay published recently, last year, I think, I called Tsaloumas the first translingual poet that we have, in the sense that he's the only poet that we have. Very few have done. Joseph Brodsky, the Russian Joseph Brodsky, had done that from into English, and his poems in English are really bad and unreadable. And despite the fact that he received the Nobel Prize for them, but as you understand, our Nobel Prize is politics and less value of poems, although he's a better essayist than a poet, but that's another story. And we have other poets as well who write in other languages, like mentioned of also the tradition of Samuel Beckett, writes in 3 languages, as you remember. And we have even Rilke, my beloved Rilke, who wrote some of his worst poems in French, and he thought that they were his best. So, as you understand, this translingualism, although in the past was something of an oddity, today has become something of a reality, as you understand, because of the huge social mobility that we have from one country to another, and people live between countries, between cultures, but most importantly, articulate themselves between languages. Most of you speak 2 or 3 languages. And sometimes what you say in one language, it cannot be said in another. And what the symbols we have in one language cannot be actually go through to another language. How can you translate a sea? I think one of the most important symbols in his Greek poems is the word of thalassa, of the sea. The thalassa, he comes from an island. Thalassa is dominant. But the beautiful word, Greek word thalassa, with all these incredible connotations that we have, going back to Homer and through the lyrical poetry and of the later age, cannot be, that's it, it cannot be essentially rendered into English with this monosyllabic word sea. The word sorry? No, Thalassa is not an ocean. First of all, the color is different, as you remember, and then the Greek Thalassa is an incredible sort of a depiction, as you understand, of a historical adventure of the people who actually drowned in that sea. This is what the essentially most islanders say when they use the word Thalassa. They don't simply admire the landscape, they talk to the dead. It's a funeral dialogue between them and the dead. You remember the famous Greek poem, and I think that in one of his Greek poems he follows it, Thalassa τους θαλασσινούς θαλασσάκιμου. This incredible alliteration of Greek Thalassa τους θαλασσινούς θαλασσάκιμου, μη τους θαλασσοδέρνεις, θαλασσώνομαι για σένα ξημερώνομαι. It's an amazing poem, as you understand, of an anonymous demotic kind, but as you see, the concept of the Thalassa is different from the word sea, as you understand, in English. Completely different. It's not a concept, it's an experience. It's not an experience, it's an evocation of a past, which we don't have it with the word sea. So Tsaloumas' poetry in Greek has these incredible expressive qualities, which we cannot analyze today because I'm not talking about his Greek work, but as we said with Eleni, we must organize a conference one day to speak specifically about the different periods, and I think these Greek poems must be analyzed appropriately. But then, as you see, the poem changes, as I said before, because thematically, in the beginning we find the poetry, especially in Observatory, of living home, the poetry of nostalgia, the poetry of remembrance. The poem is full of this evocative. I will read you soon some excerpts to understand to indicate what I mean. Then we have the poetry of living elsewhere, as the poetic gaze establishes imaginative analogies between past and present. Now he realizes that he's elsewhere and he's here. This living elsewhere becomes one of the most dominant elements in his writing. Then becomes the poetry of being here now. And this, I believe, this objective aspect of his work, I call it the poetry of nouns, because it's one of the main great assets of his work is that he uses strong nouns and proper names. He is not a poet of rhetoric. He's not the poet of circumlocution or periphrastic expressions. He is the poet of proper nouns. He avoids adjectives. I'll come back to that. Then comes the poetry, as I said, of being. As a poet is now actually here in one place, so symbol and experience are identified and converge. Finally, the poetry of living and being merge, and the poet ultimately deals with the limits of writing itself, which I think comes at the end of his poems, of his poetic career. These four stages also correspond to his various publications. The English translation Observatory. I would like to avoid any biographical analysis, of course. I don't believe in biographicism. I mean, even if you know everything about a poet, but his son is here and he will tell us more about the poet soon, I think. I don't believe that it's enough material to essentially enlighten what you will read in the poems themselves. For those of you remember that Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a 5-volume biography of Lombert just for the first 4 years of his life. 700 pages, each one of them. So can you imagine what you would have done if you go up to the 71st year of your life? It would have been, at least, as you see, 250 volumes. So sometimes biographical information simply reduces the work of an artist into a kind of commentary on the condition of production. My approach was from the beginning wants to discuss Tsaloumas' work as tries to avoid to discuss Tsaloumas' work as a document of a movement or a biographical commentary. As we all know, he was a very private person who avoided associating with big ideological projects of political affiliations. In Greece, he was always a peripheral figure, whereas in Australia, all Australian writers of all backgrounds after the 70s were placed in the limbo because of the indeterminate position of poetry in the cultural dilemmas of the period. We must not forget that the moment the writers like him Antigone Kefala, Peter Skriniewski, and other Australian others from outside appear in the Australian literary scene, this scene is divided between the modernists and the anti-modernists, between the double tradition of urban modernist aesthetics and the rustic and sophisticated rural tradition, which Les Murray called the Boeotian birthplace, από τη Βιωτία, δηλαδή από τη Λιβαδιά, the vernacular Australia, the Australian Republic, inherent, he says, in our vernacular tradition, which is to say in that folk Australia, partly imaginary, part historical, which is the real matrix of any distinctiveness we possess as a nation, the Australia of our deepest common values and identifications. Does Tsaloumas belong to this tradition of Boeotian Australianity as seen by Les Murray? And I love the Boeotian, right? You know, just the Livadιά, as I say, the Thiva, you know, where the Yifti are. So there is a dichotomy that still bedevils the profound and structural identity problem we have in Australia and in Australian writing, a problem which has long-term social and political ramifications to be discussed elsewhere in another time. When Tsaloumas appeared in English, Australian poetry was struggling to position itself vis-à-vis the mother poetry of Britain and to reposition itself vis-à-vis the American poetry of post-war period, which has impacted Australian writing profoundly after the 70s. The cultural politics of the day are well known and need no further discussion, at least tonight. However, we must reconstruct the impact that this must have had to the establishment of the day, the appearance of what I would like to call, through the work of Tsaloumas, the Mediterranean sensibility in the antipodes. We must remember that Tsaloumas came to Australia being already a formed, and should I say, an accomplished poet, who had published a number of collections in Greek, has been discussed, had participated, had seen some of the great poets of the period, and had already chosen his literary tradition. In a way, he belonged to the modernism of T.S. Eliot and George Seferis. Although a careful reading of his early poetry in Greek can show the presence of Kostis Palamas, Angelos Kelianos, Yannis Ritsos, Nikos Gatsos, and the poets who came after the Greek Civil War, whom we usually call to the poets of defeat, like Manolis Anagnostakis, Titos Patrikios, and Tassos Livaditis, amongst others. But there are also many other subterranean poetic currents in his work. I have indicated elsewhere, and we were talking with Chris before, that there are many Latin poets in his tradition. Ovid, the great poet of exile, the Tristia, for some of you who have read. And I think he makes a reference to, in his poems to one of his Ovid poems. Catullus, as well, can be detected. Also poets from the Italian tradition, which Tsaloumas must have studied in his native island, or later in Rhodes, which was under Italian control, as you remember, until 1949. 9, wasn't it after 1949? 47. Yeah, but they annexed to Greece 1949.
No, 48 was annexed to Greece.
Forget it. In that period, anyway, you know, just in that period, you know, just in that. Yeah, between 47 and 48, 49.
The 1st of April, 1947, the King of Greece came to Rome.
What am I doing here? Keep talking, you know, just keep talking. Very good. So, Palamas, classics also, and something I think for some of you who are interested, you will see that in his work, for some of you who read other poetry, like the Greco-Italian poet Ugo Foscolo and his sepulchres, the famous, you know, this tradition. And actually, I think this form that dominates the early poetry of Tsaloumas, the form of elegies, he has an elegiac tone of voice, like mourning, like something lost, elegies, elegia, and he actually talks in an interview about this. We can see his if I may say, affinity, elective affinity with Giacomo Leopardi, the great Italian, the greatest Italian poet, of course, as you know, after Dante, as well as Dante's discrete imagery, which inaugurates his works, the problematics of exile, and has become a central topic of some of his most significant poems. We find in his work, especially in the early work and in Greek work as well. I would like to read at certain stages now, we're going there, his poem, A Roman's General Letter, one of his most beautiful letters, both in Greek, poems, both in Greek and in English, not to understand this elegy that comes out of his early work. I would like to point out, as I said before, Ovid's Tristia, the poems of exile. If you remember, Ovid was sent exiled to the Black Sea, and he wrote some of his most poignant and beautiful poems while trying to go back to Rome. And this idea of pining after that lost Rome is probably one of the beginning of a literary tradition, lyrical literary tradition that we actually find to this day. And they also define the mood of the writing. As we see, pay attention to the word mood in his early poetry, but although he will continue throughout his work, which always infused with what I said, strong elegiac overtones. Elegy is the central poetic form of his work. It will remain so till the end of his poetic creative life. Tsaloumas' early poetry as well, the poetry of leaving home, is full of the Mediterranean luminosity and melancholia at the same time, that we find articulated as a theoretical process in the project in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in the essay by Albert Camus on the new Mediterranean culture, which has influenced Odysseus Elitis' solar metaphysics, as he called it. Camus suggested that the Mediterranean gives us the picture of a living, highly colored, concrete civilization which changes doctrines into its own likeness and receives ideas without changing its own nature. The existential writer and philosopher drew a distinction between the Latin West and with its Protestant gloom and guilt, and the Mediterranean, as he said, a triumphant taste for life. And I don't know the extent that we can accept Camus' Mediterranean culture, although through the sharp luminosity of the Aegean Sea, of an islander sensibility can be found permeating his Greek poems and coloring most of them. However, whoever reads Tsaloumas' A General Letter, for example, can easily understand what he meant, what Camus meant. Mistress of reveries and ruler of my heart, Domitia Fulvia, greetings. This is like Tristia by Ovid. Your blame and your reproach are just, but the hour of need has found us with plans inadequate and the words of wise men befuddled. It may be heaven's wish that once again our summer be postponed. The times are ungovernable, hard to interpret. A fearful scourge has fallen on the lands of the barbarians. Hordes from the farthest deserts of the earth, the thunder of hoof, the knife, the crackle of raging fire, tempestuous winds and inordinate rains, and then unfathomable the chasm in the sky, bringing forth supreme an evil wild-eyed sun to set afire the crust of the exhausted earth and the arteries of sap parching the very throat of nature. Now, this is, as you understand, this is magnificent. I mean, you don't explain this poem, you go through it, you know. Toifistase, as we say in Greek. You don't say anything, toifistase. You go through it. Sorry? Absolutely. In a vioma. To vionis, exactly. Did I read it well? Yeah, thank you. So, because I think, I mean, what you see here, it's one of the most expressive poems that the idea and the language actually converge, because they see on this expression, the description of the storm and tempest, you know, becomes essentially part of the language of the poem itself. It's not simply descriptive, it's not simply analytic, it's not a photography of the event, it is within the event, the language itself, as you see. And I love, as you see, the very specific things that he describes here. And a great contagion arose to oppress the land. The poor wretches with their beasts and famished king come pressing at the broad river, and the swarms increase like locusts. Watchful on the ramparts, our men silently munch their salty pork. It's incredible, just that's how strong the depiction of a situation. Clouds of smoke encircle us, pungent, stinging the tear, and the distant road of the gathering host clutches the soul. Just come on, this is better than Let's Marry. You must admit that, all right? Sorry, I know that I'm preaching the converted, but it's better than Let's Marry. I have to admit, all right? Just forget it. So, and this is, as you see, I would like to say, this is a Mediterranean sensibility, a distinct, as you understand, description, a descript, essentially recreation, some would call it transcreation, of a natural event linguistically, verbally. I find this one of the most successful aspects of his early work, the way that he brings into the poetry itself the experience of what is described within the poem, by the poem itself. It's a very, I would say, one of the major achievements of his early poetry. You can see that in Greek, as I said to Eleni, I have always some reservations about his Greek poems, but that's another story. But the same can be seen, as you understand, with this very, if I may say, arte povera, what the Italians call the arte povera, the poor art that we see in, and all these artists, as you remember, Kounelis was one of them in the 60s, were influenced by a very interesting saint of the Catholic Church, St. Francis of Assisi. In his poem, St. Francis and the Bird, which strongly recommend you to read it, as you see, page 34, I've got it here, I would like to read it to you, because it's essentially, as you see, a very interesting sort of a juxtaposition of the past and the present, as we see in this poem, St. Francis and the Bird. You remember the famous discussion that he had, St. Francis had the discussions with the birds, he was totally, as you remember, insane. And the problem was that the birds were talking back to him. That's a very interesting thought. Schizophrenia ran rampant. But here, as you understand, it's a completely different perception that we have of St. Francis, because now he calls the bird from the clothesline. No need for his shirt to be soiled, and sets it on his finger and keeps giving it a slight talking to. Now spring's on the way, and you will start wandering around. Look out for children, make yourself scarce, and stop singing the moment you see a courting couple. Lovers and poets always get the wrong idea. And I love this, this incredible, just expression that he has. And above all, keep away from places where tourists are herded together. And when you're down in the dumps, don't go looking for climbing greenery or dense tangles of foliage. No, take the road straight back to this courtyard. It's got rosemary and 7 painted kerotins with white, blue, jonquil, cloves, basil. And come again, come often. Not that I don't get many visitors, and scarcely a footstep stops at my door. And the saint goes nagging on, but the bird listens, with its eye on the window, and looks at him, and with its ears elsewhere. Now, this is an episode, as you understand, which probably came out of St. Francis's beautiful book of Little Flowers, for some of you who have read it, and has influenced Pope Francis right now. That's why he got his name from there. So I strongly recommend you to read this poetry from this perspective, as you understand. I don't know if we call this intensified sensibility of reality spiritual, but there is a very strong element of spirituality here as well. But this intensified perception of the real, of the object, of, if I may say, of life, becomes in itself a form of spirituality, as we will see later on, and continues in his poem. The poem, I think, this poem of St. Francis, we also experience the same distinctiveness of elemental realities pay attention, the enumeration of the plants that he has in his garden, everything that he likes. And then, which is the most important characteristic of a Mediterranean poetry, a sense of vital euphoria, even in front of the most tantalizing mysteries of life and faith. The poet's experience here is still an experience of intense presence. As I called it elsewhere, this is a poetry based and focused around the specificity of nouns and the somehow strong absence, obvious, visible absence of, am I talking for far too long? I'll finish soon. Absence of adjectives. Ritos in Greek, for example, is the master of adjectives, creating sometimes a plethoric rhetoric which goes beyond the realm of poetry. Many Australian poets also focus on the adjective. Peter Porter, for some of you who are interested in Australian poetry, or Judith Beveridge. I want to mention Judith Rodriguez, who actually helped, as you understand, the beginning of, and Thomas Shapcott as well. They have very strong sense of descriptive poetry, if I call it, and my neighbor in Sydney, John Tranter, whose poetry I cannot stand. Tsaloumas' love for proper names and nouns is indicative of his strong objectivism in poetry that we see dominating his verses throughout his work. Sometimes some of his poems look like enumerations of objects and things and the ways that humans interact between them. And this is, of course, there is, of course, a strong and probably subconscious religious background in his work, through which Tsaloumas expressed awe and wonderment caused by the phenomenology of bright and vibrant surfaces that we see in Byzantine icons and the Mediterranean landscape, either symbolically or pragmatically. Don't forget that one of his closest friends was one of the most important iconographers that we have in Australia, Nikos Kypreos, as you remember, and his poems, very interesting, as you see, a sort of a kind of, if I may say, a sort of a juxtaposition of the poetry and the iconography of Kypreos and Tsaloumas, who developed essentially the same period as you. Les Murray made the most absolute statement, which I love: prose is Protestant agnostic, he said, but poetry is Catholic, poetry is presence. With this statement, I also like to point the paradoxical in-between position as a poet of Orthodox background, who cannot become measurable to the traditional dichotomies between the Roman Catholic sense of intentional suffering and the Anglo-Protestant need for internalized guilt. By the way, us Greeks have no guilt whatsoever, as you know. We are so shallow that we need nothing. Just that's it. Nothing. There is no conscience in us anymore. Just as we've seen with the Greek politics. I think that Tsaloumas' poetry gradually changed as he became more aware of the contested traditions in Australian poetry and the way he delineated them in his anthology of Australian poems, which is there, and you have to buy it. You don't understand how he understood he anthologized Australian poetry, and how he he translated them, translated the poems. Essentially, I believe what he was trying to do is trying to delineate his own genealogy within the Australian poetry, which is what every anthologist does, of course. It's something that every anthologist does, but he did it very cleverly. If you can see, and I strongly recommend that because it's a bilingual edition, to see how he translates Australian sort of specific expressions, the bush, and other expressions that we see. It's an amazing exploration, as you can see, of this transcultural translingualism that we see in his work. So that book is very important, and I strongly recommend to buy it. It's only for $10, as I saw. Eleni, is it? Yeah. Nothing. A coffee. So I think Tsaloumas tried, and his anthology of Australian poems, there's another line of research, if we have youngsters here, that would follow if we want to understand what changed in his work after the publication of his collection of poems, first collection of poems in English in 1988. By then, Tsaloumas was aware of various preoccupations, if I may use the term from Judith Wright, of Australian poetry, and goes beyond the identity debates that bedevil the writing of poetry in this country, and enters a new world of a poetic experience, which is, as Judith Wright pointed out in her book, he began to accept Australia not as a political ideal, nor as a makeshift home, but as the ground we are seeing and feeling. This is a very interesting, I would say, transplantation, I would call it, and acclimatization in the new poems. His poems now lose the indescriptive narrative propensity, and they gain in interiority. In a few words, in the emotional impact of its pure lyricism. Tsaloumas, after 1988, discovered the specific quality of his poetic voice, which I think did not exist in his Greek work. Eleni disapproves of what I say, but that's my point. The verses are now pulsating with musical inwardness. His 3 night pieces and 6 variations, for example, we don't have the time to, I'll read an excerpt of this, show beyond any doubt a new ground that his poems have reclaimed from language. It is a hybrid language, partly belonging to the past, partly to the present, replete with references to an Aegean landscape, but now reconstructed and relived through the actual life here in Melbourne, the city whose landscape becomes gradually his emotional biosphere. The transition is now distinct and visible, or should I say audible. I don't think that there's any doubt that his work that followed with the portrait of a dog, the badge, or the harbour stand out as poems of powerful lyricism, emotional intensity, and formal accomplishment. Musical motifs permeate his voice as he now experiences poetically the elsewhere of Melbourne, but as an active catalyst in its emotional reality. Should I remind you here of a poem? Nick, do I have to stop? The poem by Kavafi, In the Same Place. Kavafi uses this Greek sense, you know, I lived in this place for so long, and he has this idea, σε δημιούργησα με σε χαρά, I read it in Greek, με σε λύπες, με τόσα περιστατικά, με τόσα πράγματα, and he has the most unacceptable verb in Greek. Και αισθηματοποιήθηκες ολόκληρο για μένα, which is a barbarism, a solecism in Greek. It doesn't exist. Yet he uses it in such a way that it becomes so amazingly functional in this case, right? Because he wants to give you this long aesthematopeiithikes. We don't have that in Greek, this verb, right? It becomes such long, siderodromos, as we say, right? And so, and how do we translate that? It's so difficult to translate that in English. Keely translates that, and for me, the whole of you has been transformed into feeling. Rubbish. Absolute rubbish, as you understand. You've transformed into feeling. Absolutely bad. Kavafi's poem, as you understand, the same language we find in the barge and the harbour, and the internalized musicality, annulling all forms of dissonance and incongruity. His best works are those he calls meditations, variations, improvisations, and ultimately, something which I love, nocturnes, superbly characterized by Michael Chianikas as hyperacoustics of his poetry. As he works with the subtle tonal transitions and imperceptible melodic lines within language, Chopin, Satie, Francis Poulenc, even Peter Sculthorpe appear here and there. The poetic tonalities in these collections are ontological. Language has become an ontological reality. Like the nocturnes of Bela Bartok, Tsaloumas recreates the sounds of the city, traffic, honking, talking, construction sounds, telephone ringing, and the white noise that is always and everywhere our everyday reality. He studies the relationship between urban sounds and our emotions, our emotional reactions to the objective world of our own creations. 376. Offering 2. The music I seek for you could not be rare. I can scarcely afford uncommon things, but I'll build new harmonies above non-known chords, rhythms for more generous than this, a gesture merely of dubious reach. The words you want to hear are substitutes for wind or hail, stone or star. Perhaps the rose that stains with blood or loveliness in dreams. For scritch and claw overflood the plains, or the white horse mane tossing into the nursery in some far dusk, prancing on paint-fresh meadows where no leaf stirs, nor dust. Let things be yours now. Naming is for memory, and stay at night. We listen to the rain gurgle down the pipe beside my window and southerly lush across last summer seas. In the hush before dawn, we might see sparks, hear the ringing blows of hammer shaping iron for ploughs to reap the land. The correspondence between sound and language, between the events. I love the way that he says, I can scarcely afford uncommon things. These poems, I believe, are amongst the best of Tsaloumas that ever wrote. They belong to the canon of the best poems of Australian literature. They are poems more of atmosphere and mood and less of expressiveness and statement. They also comes with the verbal minimalism we find in its last poems. His final poems continue the hyperacoustics of his earlier ones, but also add a subterranean, also almost dramatic element to his work. His poems, entitled A Winter Journey, are not simple references to Franz Schubert, Winter Rise, but also to his most enigmatic and gripping poems of his whole oeuvre. Following Wilhelm Müller's naive and sentimental poetry in Schubert's orchestration, that the German romantics love, he infused it with the most powerful Mediterranean sensibility. In his last poem, Tsaloumas developed an Orphic quality of writing. Like the emblematic poems of exile, as we find them in Heinrich Heine, Tsaloumas talks about another exile, the exile within language. And despite this, he always tries to elucidate the half-lit twilight areas between cultures, language, and of course, human beings. You have come, he says, you have come into the brightness, the true, and the unbetrayed. This is how poets perceive reality and experience, not as ideological statements or belief systems, but as emergence in the brightness of truth. Tsaloumas' recognition as a poet was a turning point in the wider history of Australian literature and part of a radical, I finished, that's the last paragraph, you're exhausted, of what we call national canon. He didn't simply change the way Australian literary criticism understood the new writers, who had started publishing since the early 70s and had already created a considerable amount of work which needed to be read, evaluated, and ultimately incorporated into the canon. But also through his recognition, the idea of multicultural politics was gradually transformed into what we call transnational or global literature. Tsaloumas belongs to the new space of literary writing, which, although having specific origins, it reaches out beyond the locality and the landscapes that have produced it. It reinvents the concept of identity and belonging, and also the way we write and read the act of writing. I would like to finish this lecture not with a panegyric, but with an elegy. An elegy written by Tsaloumas himself in his last collection of his poems, where old age and complete maturity converged to produce some of his most evocative and otherworldly sounds of existential and human magic. In the well, his voice remote through the bliss of my summer siesta, the voice unseen, but like a father's grumbling across a wilderness of misty years. There's no point in reaching out for a horizon that shifts with you. Not is it profitable to sit under the vine in the cicada's noon and wait for the breeze to stir up from the sea below. Go down and clean the well. It's cool down there and not so dark. So I went down, but found myself wandering in strange nocturnal places, with stars dull as lead. The other day, maybe long ago, I had a lute there. A tune sprung like a rose from fat soil, the death fields of holy wars, and a sob rises in my throat as I grope, sinking the plucking hand, the old nostalgic tune sunk, since in the stormy dimness of my mind. Whew. We must study more his work. It's still important today, still more significant tomorrow. I hope that this series of lectures continue the study of his work in the future and bring together the community of poets, critics, and readers who will transplant his voice to the new context, but where and for whom we would not know yet. But the origin would be here in Melbourne, the city which Tsaloumas translated into poems, sounds of a grand symphony orchestra through his verses. Thank you so much for your patience. We have something. Chris.
I'm not normally short of words, but I've got to say, I was in a fair bit of turmoil for most of that talk. A lot of...
Did I say anything stupid?
Yes.
Yeah, oh my God.
But a few things come to mind. My father still is very hard to put in a box. He really had no boundaries. And I certainly, through my childhood, only remember, until recently, that he loved this country, and you would have no idea he had these writings in him if you didn't know. And many people had no idea about what was the main part of his life, but that was his passion. And certainly I was thinking there about Vras's epochs. There were some fairly big influences in his life that coincided with some of the things Vras said, and I'd never really put this together. Certainly the Civil War, the publication of A Day in the Life by Solzhenitsyn, very big. My father believed that was a lie. He couldn't believe that book when he first read it. And that changed a lot of his views. Of course, the birth of my children. That probably accounts for it. But yeah, my father's advice... Distraction. The things that sort of come to mind about the actual constructing a poem, and I said this to Vras before, getting the first two lines on paper is the hardest bit, and the rest just follows. Never waste a full stop, that was another one, and never say more than 3 lines at a thank you speech. Vras, that's for you. Thanks,
thank you so
thanks for your kind words, and we've got a lot to talk about.
Yeah, of course, thank you.
That's your lunch for tomorrow.
Oh, lunch for tomorrow, right, thank you.
It's a unique edition of the observatory, unique in its own way.
That's it.
But
Thank
the
you so
second
much.
edition, I think, but there are annotations in there that may please you.
Oh, by him?
Yes.
Oh my God.
Thanks, Vras.
Thank you so much for this. Thank you for the trust. Are there any questions? You can say the questions in Greek or in English. Yes. Short, not statements, eh?
Thank you, Professor Vrasidas. Louis Soros here.
Vras, simply Vras.
Vras.
Louis, yeah, thank you.
About 30 years ago, I studied at Victoria University doing multicultural studies. One of my essays was to interview Dimitris Tsaloumas. My lecturer called it a folk assignment. You can imagine Dimitris Tsaloumas' surprise when I picked up the phone and rang him. I had a brief conversation with him and explained I needed to do this essay, and it was a folk assignment. And things spiralled a little bit downwards, and my lecturer asked me how did it go, and he was a bit disappointed. And anyway, and just wanted to know, I read an article on Dimitris Tsaloumas talking about how he wasn't really accepted in Greece, or his writings weren't really accepted, his literature. And I heard his son, Christos, say you couldn't quite put him in a box. Do we need to identify the writers or poets in genres per se, or we don't have to?
You have poets here to respond to that. Academics, as you know, want to put them into boxes. I don't think it's very good or very creative, and the poetry, as you understand, is an act of rebellion itself. The moment you put them in a box, it simply demolishes the strictures that the box imposes upon it. So we can't put that thing, especially, as I said, the work of such complexity, like we have in the work of Tsaloumas. The other thing you said about them being accepted in Greece, I think yesterday we discussed that with Christos, who has written as well. He gave me some essays and interviews he had with Tsaloumas, and I'm looking forward to reading them with a poet. Listen, if we paid attention to what the Greek intelligentsia would have done, Cavafy would have never been recognized. So I don't pay much attention, to be honest, to the Greeks. The Greeks are, so introspective, navel-gazing, ophaloscopy, we call them, Omphalloscopy. They look at the navel and they said, oh, this is the center of the planet. Sort of a kind of, it happens with all, peripheral, marginal societies. Societies haven't accepted modernity and thing, as you see. Although things have changed today because they have been humiliated by the crisis, so they become more open now, finally. But I think that Greek criticism has always been reluctant to accept even great writers from America, even great, if I may say, painters from the United States. I'm talking about the Greek American community because so long, much for 300 years, especially in the States. They don't recognize, they don't know them. And the problem is, as you understand, it's not interested. That's why I insist. We are nice, είμαστε ωραία παρέα εδώ, as we say, we have to create our hermeneutical principles and give works of interpretation for the future. Do not hesitate. Do not be reluctant. Do not think that you're doing something superfluous, useless, or totally parochial. We have to do it. Otherwise, nobody else will do it for us. We have to be proactive. We have to create a school of thinking down here, which will be our contribution to the Hellenic tradition worldwide. So I think this is what Tsaloumas did. Now, it won't be recognized now. As I told you, Cavafy, who recognized Cavafy? Cavafy was recognized only after he was translated into English. And the Greeks said, oh, yeah, we know him. Nobody knew him. He lived, until his death, actually in 1936, there were 2 essays written about him, 2 essays, all right? One 1904, and then something at the end of his life. He's finally dead, and he died of cancer. And that's exactly what they said. Palamas, wrote very bitchy things about him, and that's it. So this is, I think we have to move on beyond that tradition. We have to think what poets say here. I would like one day to have a session here with poets talking about the work of Tsaloumas. Έχουμε καιρό, Νίκο?
Ναι, έχουμε. Έλα, come to the front.
Καλά, πες το, έχεις δυνατή φωνή. Yeah. Francis Webb.
There are aspects of Tsaloumas that hark back to, or speak back, or somehow pick up on Francis Webb's aesthetic, or I wouldn't say aesthetic, but I would say his search for something beyond language.
I love Francis Webb, but as you know, he was mad, and a hyper-Catholic, and these kind of things. I mean, if I may say, we have a completely different perception that's why I insisted on, this incredible descriptive element that we see in Tsaloumas. Mediterraneans have a completely different perception of the visible, or what we see and how we see. I don't know if it's paranoia what I say, or the delusion, but I think if you study the work, for example, Giorgio Chirico, if you go paintings or poets, there's a distinction, there's a line above which it's Protestant, the Protestant North, and then the Mediterranean South in Europe. And I think this division has come to Australia as well. You can see that it's the, if I may say, the Eliotian, the tradition of T.S. Eliot, versus the tradition, as if I may say, that Tsaloumas brings, which is the tradition of Dante, and which is totally, they're complementary. I'm not interested in finding, just polarities and enmities. They're complementary. They are prismatic. Elitist divided poetry into two kinds of poetry: the flat poetry, as he said, of homogeneous quality, and the prismatic poetry, that language analyzes itself to its own constituents. And I think Tsaloumas belongs to this prismatic poetry tradition, which is elitist, which is Montale, which is Quasimodo, which is Nazim Hikmet, the Turkish Nazim Hikmet, Adonis, the Palestinian poet today, so many other traditions that we see. Even, if I may say, the tradition of the cinematic language of Angelopoulos in some of his best works. And, or, if I may say, Mr. Christoforidis is not here today, the music of Nikos Kalkotas. Some incredible music, actually, sort of a tradition that we see in Greece, and nobody knows anything about that. We think that, and as you see, as we heard, and Chris confirmed me, Tsaloumas grew up in music. He wanted to become a musician, you said, did he? Oh my God, that's
he was a perfectionist.
Perfectionist, yeah.
The way he constructed his poetry, he was just a hermit. And if anyone messed with it, if anyone, any translator tried to change something, he would just come out. Absolute discipline.
That's good. He gave you limits. That's a very important thing, that you understand. Limits. Very important aspect. Very cruel. But as I said, if I may say, this musical quality, I think, in his work is so important, because essentially, as you see, if you see, I didn't have the time to read the variations in one theme, meditations on the river. Now, this is a philosophical meditation, like, I don't know if you have seen, if you have heard of Debussy's, the playing to the piano, the work on the piano, Jeu de Do, the games of the water game, just amazing. I mean, sometimes you have this incredible virtuosity of using language in English, which I found it for me, because as Greeks, there's something else, as you will see, and I think that if I study his translating the poems, we grow up with a language and construct identity and a language based on polysyllabic words. Anthropos, man. English is a monosyllabic language. It's a language based on this, just this Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, bang, just chewed, syllables, which are very expressive, as you understand. But at the same time, as you see, Greek is a language that amplifies. The words are polis. We don't have monosyllabic words except yes or no in Greek. Just nothing. The rest is, bang. That's why you have a problem how you translate. If you notice how he translates his own adjectives, how you put them together. Greek is a language of immense polysyllabic internal alliterations. This is how you play with this. You create this, if you remember, this what we call weak accentuations. You know, just there is a word, there's an accent which does not, you know, just, you know, it's not an accent, but you have to say that. So this is how the language works. In English, we have monosyllabic, and I think it's an achievement to the transition from that polysyllabic structure into this monosyllabic, and I think he constitutes this. This is the problem I have with the poetry of Lesmari, for example. He is very conscious of the monosyllabic structure of English, and he abuses it. He becomes a victim of his own poetics in the end. You see, for example, poets like Eliot, like Yeats, like Pound, they adopt all these Greek words, they put them in, you know, just wow, you know, they amplify the verse. This is what Tsaloumas did as well in a very effective way, and I think that's why I didn't understand some negative reviews of his last collection that was published in Cordite as well, you know, just, you know, because they say that this is a peculiar form of English. It is a centered, or if I'm decentered English. This form of decentering the language. But here, you know, as I said, the poetry in Australia is sort of a kind of either Rimbaud or John O'Hara or a folk poet like sort of a kind the ballads of Banjo Paterson. This is what happens, unfortunately. The Banjo Paterson tradition is very strong still here. You know, A.D. Hope continued the tradition. Judith Wright tried to open it up. The poets of the 70s tried to seven down, but they're still strong, the tradition. You know, I mean, some of the best poets write still with rhyme and meter, in cadenza, in English. I don't know, the language has changed so much that I don't think that we can use that anymore. But anyway, it becomes a sort of a kind of self-referential element. Yes? We have enough time to talk?
One final question. We can't say no to Olga, so you're one. Go ahead, Olga.
You can bring the part of the microphone up at him. Βγάλτο.
He came to Australia when he was 30, is that right? Did he know English already?
Did he know English already?
Spoke Italian, French, English,
and Latin, yeah. He said that in one interview, I think. Sorry, what is that?
Anyway, because he came at 30, his command of English is tremendous, and that's why I wondered, did he come with a language already, or he learnt it here?
As we said, I mean, I think that English was his fourth language, or fifth, I would say. For me, it's a very interesting aspect as well of his knowledge of English. He says in one of his interviews that he read, and it's very interesting as well, he didn't read The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot first. He read the 4 quartets by T.S. Eliot in a translation by Antonis de Kavalis in 1951 in Athens, which is a very interesting translation. It's not the Ferris translation, it's the Kavalis translation. So essentially I believe that his poetry, in a strange way, has the English of Eliot through the Greek translation of Eliot in English. You know, it's a very beautiful sort of a kind of hybridity of linguistic expression. And I think that when he translates himself, Eleni, what do you think when he translates himself? Is he successful? It's a recreation, essentially, eh? Yeah, I love the title as well, Δίφορος Καρπός, eh? Δίφορος, which you have twice, twice born, we call it, eh? Δίφορος Καπνός, twice born harvest, something like that, or fruit, harvest. It's very interesting how he recreates his own writing in this case. But I think I'll insist on that, and Chris, I can detect the Latin element in him, because as I grow older, I abandoned Greek for Latin. I decided to write only in Latin from now on, sort of a kind, because I had enough of Greek. You know, just we're very, it's a corpulent language. The other is skeletal, it's bony. You know, nothing superfluous. You can't say anything superfluous in Latin. But he has this very strong sense of a Latin sort of a kind of structure of sentence, which I find magnificent in this case, because we Greeks, you know, we are blah blah blah, as you understand. You know, we are verbose. He has a sparsity, a laconic element in his language, which is really, I can't place it in Leros. No, it was. Did you carry it well? Carry it out well? Did you create a lot of misinterpretations? Oh, good. You know.
Therein lies a clue that this marrying thing that when it was mentioned, there's a bit of history in that. And that would have closed some doors.
Yeah. Mary is a bitch. You know, just an absolute bitchy man. You know, I met him twice, and he's so bad that I can't even describe him. I saw him recently in Sydney, and I said, Mr. Murray, he knew me from the past. He knew that I was a fruitcake. I said, Mr. Murray, you stopped writing poems in 1992. That's it. Ever since, you make ideological statements of how conservative you are and how great you are. And in the end, I said, you lose everything that you have achieved, because that's the last collection he made. It was in 1992. Ever since, blah, blah, and I am great, and nobody likes me because I'm a Catholic. Who cares if you're a Catholic and if you're a Protestant, but you are whatever you are, you know, just as long as you're bad, as he is. He's an absolute bitchy. And remember years ago when we had a conference at the University of Athens, of the University of Sydney, I invited him to talk, and I had invited Antigone Kefala, in the same thing. I had him, I had Robert Anderson, I had John Tranter, Antigone Kefala, and Judith Beveridge. He was not referring directly to Tsaloumas, but I asked him what he thinks about poetry of non-English speakers, and he said this is absolute rubbish. You know, it's politics, and nobody will pay attention to this poetry in a few years from now. Well, I saw him last 2 weeks ago, and I said, nobody will pay attention to your poetry in a few years from now. I said, when you go away, you'll be forgotten, because you now simply control the political system. So that's politics. I know what you mean, and this political, you know, just Les Marie is essentially a totem, eh? It's a totemic presence, doesn't exist. He doesn't really exist. It's like he's like these statues in the Easter Island. You know, just he doesn't really exist as an individual. And anyway, with having said that, can I read a poem before finishing? Because I just I said a lot of bad things about Murray, and so he doesn't deserve so much attention. But I would like to read before finishing. You know, just Old Man's Last Pilgrimage. On this, my last pilgrimage, I travel by what light and signs the sky affords. I do penance, seek no remissions of sins. Majestic highways and safe roads took me to famous places of worship in the far country of youth, where I prayed and saw my dreams come true. Yet all magician time turn all these gifts to tracts of waste and thirst, where I yielded number and calculation to reckon the worth of friend and foe. This I regret, though my riches grew and glowed, yielding a measure of satisfaction. Now new lands, born of the lifting mists, beckon to the nomadic soul. Uncharted streams and mountain paths lead it to shrines long strayed from memory, mentioned in parchments long decayed, where I now hear music not heard before, smell scents from alabaster jars, and phials buried in vaulted tombs, to make sweet the sleep of queens, visit all crimes that strange faith has turned to things of veneration. On this, my last pilgrimage, I seek no evidence of fact, but firmer certainties, not hope, but truth of nobler substance, where, in secret folds, the mind still dreams of wings. Καλά. Εδώ παθαίνουμε που λένε, έτσι, δεν είναι... Όπως έλεγε και ο Μπιθικότης, παθαίνω ψυχολογία. Thank you so much for your patience.
But I see that as much as we like your verbosity, we have to bring proceedings to a close.
I'm dead now.
And I honestly, I don't think we could have had a better speaker to open this, what will be an annual commemorative lectures. Thank you very much for that. And the book you're plugging before, we've already sort of sold out, so maybe we'll get some more in future, but there's still a few books left behind.
Did you sell them all?
Yes. This is the one. We'll have some more next time round. And just a small gift of appreciation, and we hope to see you again very soon.
Drink.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.